Your support of the Candid Frame over the past 12 years has been invaluable to us. You have not only helped us produce over 400 episodes, but your donations directly helped us to create the Candid Frame app and making it available for free. We are now proud to announce the release of a new way for you to listen to TCF. We have released a new skill that is compatible with Amazon Alexa-enabled devices. Using voice commands, you can listen to the latest episodes, jump forward and back, and if you stop listening partway through an episode, it will remember where you left off. And like the Candid Frame app, it's free for users in the US and Canada. In the coming months, the skill will be available in other countries, and I'll let you know when those become available. You can help and continue to support the work that we do here by contributing as little as $2 a month to our Patreon campaign. You not only help us to meet our cost of production, but provide us the means to improve the quality of the show and do so much more. Contribute today by visiting patreon.com/The Candid Frame. This is Ibarionex, X, and this is The Candid Frame. I can't believe that we are already halfway through the year. Plans that I had for things that were once months away are now just around the corner. Sometimes I feel like I'm going 100 miles per hour while strapped atop the hood of a car. But it also means that some things that I've been looking forward to are about to happen, which include my attendance at Street Photo SF in June. This street photography festival, which is celebrating its third year, has been on my radar for a while, and I'm excited that I will finally be attending as well as conducting a workshop there. So I thought that this would be a perfect opportunity to introduce you to Ken Walton, the founder of Street Photo SF. Hey, Ken, welcome. Good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ibarionex. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, I've been aware of the festival for the last couple of years, so I'm finally going to be able to come up there, and I'm excited. But for people who are not familiar with the festival, why don't you tell us, about its inception and what it's all about?
Well, we're going into our third year this year. We've grown quite a bit each year, and this is it's in San Francisco the week. It's usually the sort of first, second week of June, so it's June 4th through 10th. We have a whole week of free photo walks, lectures, workshops, slideshows, all sorts of events related to street photography. We bring in workshop teachers and lecturers from around the globe, and visitors as well join us from all over the planet to come in. So it's a good time. We last year we had close to 250 people at our last lecture with Bruce Gilden. So we get a nice turnout. And it's just a really good way to connect with other street photographers and, learn, share, party, whatever.
How'd the whole concept come about?
Well, I started shooting myself back in at the very end of 2014, and I just became obsessed with it. And I was doing it all the time, and I wanted to sort of do something bigger than just taking pictures and sharing them on social media. And I looked at what Miami was doing, and I saw at the time that was the only one out there. And I thought San Francisco, and I still think it's a great place to shoot, and it's got a vibrant street photography community, but it's not a very big dot on the map. And I wanted to build the community locally and provide a forum to kind of show off this place as a great place to visit, a great place to shoot. And that's what led to it. I went out and visited Miami, and I saw what they were doing, and I got some ideas from them and just put together my own program the next year. Had you ever done anything like this before, in terms of like a conference like this? No, I haven't. It was all new, and it was a big mystery to me. And I had a friend around that time who was starting a totally unrelated sort of a conference for the first time herself. And she kind of gave me a pep talk and said, no, you definitely can throw this together in 6 months. So that's what I did. It was a first timer, and it does get easier every year.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
Well, you've brought together some amazing, talented people. You mentioned Bruce Gilden last year, but who are some of the people who have attended in the past, and who's going to be attending this year?
I'm gonna miss some names, but first year we had Richard Bram, Vineet Vohra. We had Don Hudson's been with us both years. TC Lin came in. We had a bunch of people, and the list goes on and on. Last year it was Bruce Gilden, Michelle Grosskopf, and some other members of Burn My Eye, of Full Frontal Flash were here. Vineet was back. We had Jesse Marlowe and Aaron Berger from In Public. Jack Simon's been here every year. This year, we've tried to really mix it up. We have a whole different set of people coming. We have Jeff Mermelstein coming in from New York City. Really excited about that. We have 2 members of Burn My Eye coming in to do a workshop. That's Andy Kochanowski from Detroit and TC Lin coming in from Taipei. We've also got a Full Frontal Flash street photography workshop. That's with Michelle Grosskopf, Johan Yelbo, Connor Berry, Ben Helton, Skyed Wang, and Tyler Simpson. A bunch of them are joining together for this workshop. And of course, we're lucky enough to have you coming up for the first time from LA to teach your 2-day weekend workshop as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to being up there, and it's amazing the community that's out there, as you mentioned, because I know there's a real thriving street photography community, but having sort of a single place where people get together is going to be amazing.
Yeah. It's been nice. We have a couple of shows this year actually featuring local collectives of street photographers. I'm pretty excited about that.
So, tell me what the feel is like. I mean, you mentioned that some events are paid, obviously workshops, but you offer some free events as well. What's the dynamic like for people who attend?
Well, so we've actually tried to keep almost the entire festival free of charge. The only thing you really would have to pay for would be a workshop. The teachers need to get paid. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to have portfolio reviews, and there's a small fee associated with those. But everything else, top tier lectures and slideshows. We have a book lab, which is going to be a mini 1-day workshop about making books. We're going to have a zine fair, 4 or 5 different gallery openings with different shows all around town. This is all free. So we also have free photo walks every day, led by local volunteers. Experienced street photographers will take you around all the different neighborhoods. So there's kind of a buzz. It's sort of a community build. We try to have beer and wine at the events at night, and people tend to kind of get together and go out afterwards most nights. So there's a bit of a celebratory kind of a party atmosphere as well as some really intense study as well. So
how's it changed your relationship with the street photography community as a result of putting this event together for the last 3 years?
Yeah, I don't know. I started it when I was so green, so I don't know. I don't really know how it's changed. I will say, as a result of running this, I've been really lucky to meet so many interesting people around the world who've come in for it and who've worked with the festival. So I feel like it's sort of got me on the inside of several concentric circles of street photography communities around the planet, and I feel like I could go just about to any country now and meet up with someone and get a tour of the local best places to shoot as a result of running the festival. So that's kind of nice. I've just gotten to know a lot of people.
Yeah, and you're getting people who attend who are not just from San Francisco. I know a couple of people are coming up from LA, but do you have a sense of where people are coming from to attend this?
Yeah, I've heard of people coming in really from around the world. I mean, every year we've had people from Europe and Asia come in, and Latin America. Several people from Mexico came in last year. But I would say it's we don't have a ton of people from overseas, but I would say, this year we're probably going to have 40 people come in from outside the country. That's just a ballpark guess. And that's from everywhere from Sweden to Taiwan to Brazil, all over the place.
So where is the event going to be held? And for people who are, say, coming in out of town, what are some of the logistics that they should consider if they want to attend?
I would say logistics, book early, look around, give Airbnb a chance, although that's not always even the best deal in this town. But, try to maybe share a place with somebody. Hotels can be expensive here. Flights are actually usually relatively inexpensive to San Francisco. The main event this is the same as last year. It's the Harvey Milk Photo Center, which is a really big community center run by the San Francisco Department of Parks and Recreation. It's a huge photo center. I think it's one of the largest darkrooms in the United States. They have a big auditorium and a gallery and a classroom, and that's a good hub. But we also have satellite exhibitions at the Leica store and at several other locations around town. So San Francisco is pretty easy to get around. If you get up here, you can pretty much stay anywhere and not be very far away from the festival events. But Harvey Milk Photo Center is sort of smack dab right in the middle of the city.
And what are the dates for the whole event?
It's June 4th through 10th, 2018.
Okay. And are there still seats available for some of the workshops that are being held?
Yeah, there are. At this point, there are seats available for all of them, although we are starting to sell more over the last few days, and the Mermelstein workshop is getting close to full, but there is still room in all of them, and we would be happy to have more students coming in.
Great. And where can people go to find out more about the workshop and attend, the event and maybe sign up for the workshops?
We're at streetphoto.org, and that's spelled a lot. It's STREETFOTO, streetphoto.org, and everything's right there on the website.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Another photographer who resides in Northern California is Marc Silber, who first came to my attention via his YouTube channel. With his series Advancing Your Digital Photography, he showcased video interviews with photographers such as Chase Jarvis, Thomas Hawk, Bambi Cantrell, and Matthew Jordan Smith. He's also featured fascinating conversations with descendants of both Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, providing some invaluable insights into these two master photographers. Marc is also an accomplished photographer, and he's just released a wonderful book on composition titled The Secrets to Amazing Photos, 83 Composition Tools from the Masters. Since expanding my sense of composition has been on the forefront of my mind recently, I thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to share this conversation with you. Well, Marc, welcome to The Candid Frame. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I love being here.
I've enjoyed the videos that you produced over the years where you interviewed photographers. I thought that they were exceptionally well done, and they were always very insightful. They were a great resource for me, not only in terms of just learning about different photographers' process, but just, observing your approach and your style to interviewing is something always piquing my interest. So I got to say, I've really enjoyed seeing you at work.
I appreciate that. I've always considered that my role is not to be the kind of the star of the show, but to facilitate the viewer to ask the kinds of questions that I think they want to know about. And, I'm genuinely interested in who these people are and how they work. So it's been a fun gig. I've really enjoyed it.
You probably, like me, you've learned a lot about the photographic process as a result of interviewing these people. And your latest book is about composition. But before we get into the contents of the book, I wanted to get an understanding in terms of what you think you've learned from these many interviews with the photographers, since so much of your conversations revolved around not so much the career and the business side of photography, but about the process of creating photographs.
It's an interesting thing. I sort of tend to not realize how much I've learned until I start doing these shows. And all of a sudden, I realize I've got this tremendous sort of storehouse of information. But, the other part of it is when what you see in the interview is like a, 8 or 10 minute version of a conversation that lasted maybe an hour on camera and maybe an hour before. And then by the time I'm done editing it, I've watched it 12 times, to the point where I'm like, I'm so done with this thing. But what happens for me is that those really important points just resonate. And those are the points. I mean, it's so hard to cut out content. If I take do an interview with some of my favorite photographers. Chris Burkhardt, I interviewed him before he became huge on Instagram. And here was, 21-year-old, 22, something like that. Phenomenal photographer. But it was just loaded with these tips that were just popping right out. And I used many of those in my first book. What I found was fascinating was how generous these photographers were and are at sharing their secret sauce. And there's no reason they should be guarded about it, because you can share all the secret sauce you want. It doesn't mean that somebody else is going to be able to pick it up and immediately rise to that level. But, the reason I started this series to begin with is I was doing, I've been an educator most of my life, and I've been doing seminars and workshops, and I'd quote Ansel Adams in particular at that time, talking about visualization. And I thought, wouldn't it be great, instead of me quoting him, if I could actually find content with him explaining exactly what he means by visualization. And I was fortunate enough to be given this unreleased footage from the family where he did exactly that. And you'll see those on my YouTube site. And then it just kind of went on from there. This was 2009. I interviewed Chase Jarvis, and that sort of opened a whole new set of doors for me. And then he introduced me to Joe McNally, and he introduced me to David Harvey, and it just sort of sprung from there. So for me, it's just been an amazing experience to have all that information. And that's why now I'm focused primarily on writing books, because I need to take that kind of wealth of information, not just from them, but my own research and what I've done in terms of where I've taken my photography and understanding photography, and put that into a book. And that's really what you'll find me doing mostly these days.
I saw that in the presentation that you did in B&H Photo, that you sort of broke down the parts of visualization. Can you share those with us?
Yeah, visualization, so if you look at almost every one of the photographers I interviewed mentioned it in some way or another. The concept of it is basically, before you press the shutter, you have to have an idea what you want to photograph. And that's something that you, as the artist, conceive of. And if you think about it, any art form really goes that way. Before a sculptor is going to, start chipping away at wood or bronze or whatever their medium is, they have to know, they have to have an idea where this is going. And this is really the key point of fine art photography, or even actually, really, it goes to any type of photography, even sports. You have to think in terms of, here's a great one from Chris Burkhardt. He's a sports photographer. He's a surf photographer. And he said, he'll be standing shooting the exact same scene with 40 other guys around him. And the first thing he does is he makes sure he's not standing in the same spot that they all are. And so in other words, he visualizes it from a different angle, perspective, height, whatever, to get his unique story told. But the steps of visualization are basically learning to first see it in your own mind before you press the shutter, and then following through, knowing your camera, because it's great to visualize something, but if you don't know how to make that camera tell that story, you're going to miss it. And then we get into all the points of composition, which is what my new book is about. And then processing the image is you're still visualizing it. You look at it in Photoshop or Lightroom, or in the days when we were all in the darkroom. You think about it in terms of, how do I want this thing to look? Do I want to really up the contrast, for instance? In digital photography, you might say in your mind's eye, you think, I know this is a black and white photograph. So you go through the steps of translating a color image into black and white. Once you've processed it, then of course the next stage is getting your work out to the world. And all the way along, and I have a graphic in my book, visualization is the center of this process, because all the way along, you're the one who's guiding that process. And that's the beauty of it. And there's ways to strengthen your visualization. One of the best ways is to look at works of the masters. Joey L., who is another unbelievably talented photographer who got his start at age 16 with the first Twilight film. And he just has, soared continuously since then. But his genius is that he, as a 16-year-old, I think this is pretty remarkable, but he studied the work of all sorts of different masters and looked at how their lighting, how they use lighting, how they compose within the frame of their canvas, and he's translated that into his photographs, and they're remarkable.
Yeah, that whole connection between visualization and composition, I think, is absolutely an important one, because I think that for too many photographers, there is a disconnect between the two. I think people think of composition and it stops at the rule of thirds. And they say, okay, I see something, let me put it in that, follow that rule, and then I don't have to think about it. And then they're more than likely get very disappointed at the photograph because they really didn't compose a photograph. They just placed the element in a certain area of the frame and then crossed their fingers.
Exactly.
And I think that the visualization is really about a careful way of seeing and owning that frame, because whether it's a photographer or whether it's a great painter, the most adept at their art are cognizant of every single millimeter in the frame, not just what they include in the frame, but what they exclude, and
especially,
and how they, space all those different elements so that they're cleanly defined in the frame. I understand it can be kind of difficult for someone who's relatively new to photography, or even someone who's been shooting for a while, to grasp that. How do you help people to have an understanding of not only the importance of that, but how to effectively do it when they go out and try and make a photograph?
Yeah, it's kind of like I use the analogy of learning to cook. And the reason I wrote my new book is because composition is an interesting subject, but it's one that nobody's really addressed in detail before, which is kind of amazing. So there's two schools. There's the Edward Weston school, which is, hey, there's no rules to composition. You just have to kind of develop your style. Okay. That's one side of the pendulum. The other side of the pendulum is a whole set of rules. Okay, we have the rule of thirds and we have leading lines, and you have this sort of idea that if you just follow, like you said, you just follow this formula, that somehow a great photograph is going to spring out of it. Well, as with most things in life, the answer lies in the middle somewhere. The truth is, there are no rules. That's correct. I mean, the rule of thirds isn't like the law of gravity. If you let go of your camera, it's going to fall and break. That's a law. That's gravity at work. If you don't compose with this quote rule of thirds, and you put your subject, smack in the center, which many great photographs and portraits have just that, does something happen? Is the camera going to break, or you're going to get a ticket from the aesthetic police or something? Obviously not. So they're not rules, they're guidelines. And what I discovered, because so many people have asked me over the years, Mark, how do I learn to compose better? I just think my photos are boring, and I see these great photographers and they seem to have some knack. How did they develop that? Well, So that's why I tackled this book, and I came up with 83 different formats, from very, very simple to more and more interesting ways of portraying your image. But I think, to answer your question, the way you learn composition, the way you learn to visualize is, first of all, again, go to museums, study the works of masters, look at it ideally offline, because if we spend too much time on a computer, you're getting a secondhand version of it, right? But when you see it, that's why it's so important to see art live and see the thickness of the paint and the reflection of light and all these different subtleties you're never going to get by just looking at an image of it. But spend a lot of time doing that and figure out what resonates for you. And I have an exercise in my first book. When you look at a piece of art, don't just do this. This is the problem with our modern social media. It's like likes, right? Well, okay, likes. I got so many likes, but that's not a critique. It's look at it and see, why are you attracted to this piece of art? How did that artist use light in that image? Take Vermeer, for example. What an amazing artist he was. He had 2 windows in his studio. He pretty much painted everything in the same room. It had 2 north-facing windows, and he would block off sometimes one of them, so only having one window. So the subject was lit from that north-facing window. The light would strike, I'm thinking of the milkmaid, the famous one. Mm-hmm. The light is striking her face. On that side, she's lit. On the other side, it's shadowed. And you just see how he used this one light source to tell this story of this milkmaid. And that's something, that's a great way to learn. If you look at sports, how much time is spent by a great athlete in preparation of competition? I don't know what the actual ratio is, but it's something like 20-1 in terms of practice to actual performance. And I think in our modern age, I believe this is a big misconception or a big disconnect, as you said, which is you just kind of go out with your camera and bang, 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 and you're going to come back with a set of great photographs. Not so much. That isn't really how the great photographers that I know do it and did it. Yes, later in their career, when it becomes very instinctive, sure, we all shoot like that. But early on, spend some time learning and learn from those masters that came before us. And by the way, I have to mention this. It's in the preface of my book. There is another disconnect, which is, where did photography come from? It's a relatively new art form. I mean, as an art form, it really didn't sort of emerge until, I'd say, the 20s and 30s. So it's 100, not even 100 years ago as an art form. But photography grew out of painting and drawing, which have obviously been around for centuries. And it's really important to realize that we're part of an ongoing urge in man to tell visual stories that go all the way back to cave paintings, because it must have been a pretty incredible experience when those first cave artists figured out that they could not just gesture and say whatever monosyllables they had at that time, but they could draw a picture and show their fellow cave dwellers what it was like to see a saber-toothed tiger, And that's what we do with photography. We're trying to convey the story that we saw, and ideally it has emotion in it, it has impact, it has a connection from the viewer to what you saw, and you're passing that along as a visual story, just like we pass along verbal stories. But that's really the set of skills that I feel needs to be developed to become a great artist.
And for me, I think that one of the things that I try to teach my students is slow down enough so that you can see what your background is. Mm-hmm. And whether or not it serves or it doesn't serve your subject. I think that's a real good starting point. But what are some of the things that you think people have to consider about what's behind their subject in order to lead to making a good composition?
Boy, you hit it on the head. So you've got to look at Deanne Fitzmaurice, who's just a phenomenal documentary photographer, said in one of my interviews, you really have to think of your photograph in terms of layers. And, she was the first person I heard speak of layers not in a Photoshop sense, but in terms of life or, actually getting out there and photographing. And she said, look at your photograph in terms of layers. You have a foreground, you have where your subject is, and you have your background. And you want to look at each one of those and make sure they're working together. So the most obvious example of not doing that is you're trying to take a portrait and the background is going to completely overwhelm your subject. Let's say I'm outside and the background is very brightly lit and my subject is in shade. Well, it's just going to, unless I'm trying to make it into a silhouette, it's going to completely overshadow my subject. Or let's say there's a lot of distracting lines. You've got fences behind them and there's spikes coming out of their head. I mean, those are obvious examples. Or a telephone pole or a garbage can, And, we can say, well, I'll deal with that garbage can in Photoshop or Lightroom and get rid of it. I'm really kind of an old school photographer. Why don't you just clean up your background right there? Why don't we compose in the camera and look at, is that background going to serve the purpose of telling that story, or is it going to distract? And this gets into something I mentioned, and it's kind of near the end of my book. My new book, I say, listen, there's two approaches to photography, as there are in life. You can be passive or you can be active. A passive photographer sort of just pushes the shutter no matter what's going on. And you kind of think, well, it's just the way it looks. I'm gonna be true to what life dished out to me and just press the shutter. Okay, well, actually, great photographers don't really approach it that way. All the skilled photographers I know are active. If you have a subject and the background is poor, move them or go to a different camera angle, but do something actively to change that. So you look at it, then look at the frame. Bob Holmes, who's also in my books, and I've done many interviews with him, he said, you are responsible for everything in that frame. And if there's something that shouldn't be there, then you should do something about it. This is probably the biggest secret for a new photographer, is many times they're just willing to include way too much stuff in the frame. Why? Does it help the photograph? Maybe it's really distracting. If you're trying to take a photograph of your kid swinging the bat, let's say, at a game, and there's a really shiny object down in the right-hand corner, where's the viewer's eye going to go? Not to your kid, but to that shiny object. Well, is that your story? Probably not. So crop it. Move in a little tighter, get rid of that shiny object and compose in the camera. Yes, you can deal with those things later, and I often do, and I mess up like everybody else, and I have to get my masking out or whatever if I'm using Lightroom, I'm using the healing tool. But try not to do that. Try to do all your composing in the camera. I think you're going to be happier with the results.
There's a pull quote they have in the book. It says, composition is simply the arrangement of your subject matter within the confines of your picture space. And that's by William Palouse.
Yeah.
And I think that really is a good way of looking at composition rather than being a hard and fast rule. It's where you decide to place all those different elements relative to each other in the frame. That's really at the heart of composition. It's what I'm doing all the time. I see all these sort of disparate elements. I decide what's in the frame and what I have to get out. And the stuff that I have in the frame, it's like I got to figure out their relationship to each other. And it's so much of it's dictated from where do I stand? You know, do I use a wide angle? Do I use a telephoto? Do I use a wide aperture, a small aperture? And all of that is being dictated by the relationship that my visualization is leading me to choose where those things are in the frame.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that is really sort of the key that could help a lot of people start to really grasp how they can start composing their photographs, considering the relationship of objects within the frame.
Yeah, because, really there's a lot of complicated definitions of composition, but I like that definition because it's really very simple. And, I believe that anything well understood becomes a simplicity, not a complexity. So if you strip it down, you've got a frame, your camera. Most of the time it's a rectangle. I have, a Hasselblad and I have a Rolleiflex. Those are square, but most people are not shooting with those cameras. They're shooting with a rectangle. So you've got a rectangle. And what you put within that rectangle is essentially what composition is all about. Now, you can use your hands to create a frame, which I recommend, without even having your camera. You basically make two L's out of your fingers. I put it in my book to show you how to do it. You make two L's and you put them together and you have a rectangle. And a really good exercise is to go around and just use your hands as a framing tool. You can also cut out a piece of cardboard. That's another way of doing it, and cut it like a picture frame map, and then hold that up and go around. Now, why do you want to do that without a camera? Is because as soon as you've got a camera pressed to your face, you're kind of into the next phase of the whole process. And you often are getting into the technical side of like what aperture and where do I want to focus and all this other stuff. But if you strip it back to the essence of framing, is how am I going to put that subject within that rectangular frame? It's really time well spent. I still do that all the time. You'll see me walking around, and you'll see this with film directors too. You take your fingers and you make that rectangular frame, and you want to kind of visualize how's it going to look within there. And that, I've got 83 composition tools, but they're all essentially variations of framing. Just like you could say, you go into a kitchen, what's the most commonly used tool in that kitchen? It's a knife. But, how many different ways do you use a knife within the course of cooking a meal? You're using it in so many different ways, and even different types of knives, and, to end up with this meal that looks really great. So that's another kind of analogy that I give in terms of composition. Learn to read a recipe, which is what I'm giving you here. I'm giving you 83 different recipes that you don't even have to read them consecutively. You can flip through the book until you find one that sort of sparks for you, and you go, oh, that's cool. Diagonal lines. Yeah, I like that, and then do it, shoot it, and see how it looks.
I think one of the things that's really kind of important not to lose sight of is that so much of photography, at least for me, is spurred by a moment of discovery. I'm walking down the street, I see something, my heart just skips a beat. I sense its potential for a photograph. And what I'm trying to do using the camera, using what I understand of composition and light and shadow and all those things, is to recreate that moment of discovery in the photograph for the viewer who doesn't have the benefit of being there. And I was looking at the work of Stephen Shore and W. Eugene Richards the other day. Very different photographers, a very different subject matter. But when I took a look at those photographs, I felt those moments of discovery. Even with some of the photographs that I'd seen years before that I was familiar with, I was sitting there with their books in my lap, going through them and taking them in and experiencing them. And I think that that's really part of the missing piece for a lot of the photographs that I see students create, is that there is no moment of discovery in those photographs. And I think that there needs to be a sort of a connection between that moment of revelation and the choices that you make subsequently when you make the photograph.
Totally.
So, how do you find what do you find effective to be able to sort of bridge that gap in your own work when you see something, and then you have to jump all the hurdles and all the hoops to get a photograph that reflects how you felt at that moment?
Yeah, that's really the key to the whole thing. Well, it comes down to being prepared, I believe. And one thing I should just mention here, just so that I'm not giving the impression that visualization is this kind of long, cerebral process, that you're sitting there thinking for minutes on end, and then you finally press the shutter. Visualization can occur in the fraction of a second also. Take the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was, capturing the moment. So how did he know, for instance, there's this there's so many photographs that I love of his, but there's one where this guy is jumping over a mud puddle, it's a mud puddle, basically, puddle in the ground. And how did he know to press the shutter at that exact moment when he catches that guy midair? So he had to visualize that. But that visualization might have occurred a moment, like a minute before. He says, look, I see this guy kind of coming up to this puddle, and I think he might take a leap over it. If I stand here and I press the shutter, he had to anticipate where that guy would be over the puddle and press the shutter a moment before that. That's split-second visualization. But, you hit on something. I think it's being receptive. How do you find those moments that really connect, that where there's such an impact of light or motion or whatever it is that really draws your eye in? That comes from being prepared, knowing your tools so well that you don't have to think about them, knowing your composition tools, your camera, all these different tools, and that all comes from practice. So, there's the Louis Pasteur quote, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Ansel Adams changed it to "Chance favors the prepared photographer." Mm-hmm. And it's true. Some of Ansel's most famous work were shot on the spur of the moment. I have a story of the moon in New Mexico, the moon over the graveyard in New Mexico. He's driving along in his Cadillac station wagon, sees the moon, sets up his camera, and he can't find his exposure meter. He's got this 8x10 camera, and he can't find his exposure meter. Well, he did the math in his head, and he figured it out, and he captured it. It was a little thin. The negative was actually kind of thin. And he went back to his darkroom and corrected it. But he said he had just enough time to capture that one image, and then he pulled the plate out, turned it around, and the moon was, it was gone. So that's how you have to approach photography. You may not have a second chance. And learn to see. I call it getting in the zone. Mm-hmm. There's something that clicks in for me when I start to see photographs. Because, you can be going through life. Let's say you're a tourist and you're in Paris and you're with friends and you're walking around and, you're distracted. You're thinking about a lot of other things and you're walking by one great photograph after another, maybe. And on the other hand, you might go out by yourself, totally with the mission of saying, okay, I want to come back with at least one outstanding photograph. You get into the zone and you look and you connect. And when you connect, then you can make your camera connect, and then you can make your viewer connect with that moment.
Yeah. One of the things I tell my students all the time is you have to stop seeing literally and start seeing graphically. Mm-hmm. Because whatever drew you into that scene, that's all well and good. But at that point, you have to take that step back and you have to start looking at it in terms of line and shape and light and color. And in your book, you have several examples where you're describing, looking at a scene graphically, and you're describing all the different sort of lines and shapes that the different photographs that illustrate those chapters sort of create within the context of the frame. Talk about why that's so important to be able to recognize those variances in terms of line and shape towards building a successful composition.
Yeah. Well, again, I believe that composition is a geometric function. I mean, we're starting with a rectangle, and then what are we photographing but various different lines and forms? So I'm looking at an example in the book of using diagonal lines. So each of these are, again, if you think about it in terms of cooking, you have spices and different elements that you can add to your dish to bring out the flavors. So we're trying to build a vocabulary as artists so that we can speak fluently to the viewer, to what we saw. So a diagonal line is really interesting. It's a line like any other line, but because it's on a diagonal, it brings about the feeling of vitality and dynamic motion. So if you're trying to show something that happened with motion in it, some people are walking, let's say, or I have a picture of a car that on page 43, on a freeway overpass, and another on the page next to it is some penguins in South Africa walking. I'm trying to show that they're in motion, not static. And even though we've got a two-dimensional still image, you can do things to either emphasize the motion or make it look very stable and static, depending on, like a flat line, horizontal line will bring about the feeling of something being static. So if you know these different, what you're doing with these lines, then you can start playing with them and putting them together to tell the kinds of stories that you want. Symmetry is another geometric function, and symmetry is very powerful. I don't know, I can't tell you, why does our eye seem to love symmetry? I don't know. It's some sort of aesthetic thing that we find pleasing. And when you use it in a photograph, you're going with, some sort of basic human quality where we like that kind of order. And when we see it, it looks aesthetic to us. And circles are also very appealing. Frames, like, when we use a frame, we have somebody stand in a door frame or a window frame, and their face is framed by the window, for instance. What that does is it just emphasizes, this is where I want your eye to go. I want you to look at my subject right here. And that brings up a really powerful concept, Right at the end of the book, I'd already written this chapter, but at the end of the book, I went over and had a visit with Kim Weston, Edward Weston's grandson. Edward Weston is, to any viewers who haven't studied his work, please take some time to look at what he did. And I have a couple of videos discussing this. But what was remarkable about Edward Weston is he took everyday objects, and I'll tell you what I mean in a minute by everyday, but he took everyday objects and drew the beauty out in them. So everyday objects, peppers, his famous pepper number 30, 6-hour exposure. And you look at this and you think, I look at peppers in the grocery store all the time. I have them in my kitchen and I cut them up. Have I ever taken a photograph of a pepper? Never. Would I? Probably not. But somehow he pierced that veil of whatever could stand between us and his sense of aesthetics, and thought, if I capture this pepper just like this, it's going to be really beautiful. And he did. He has another photograph, 1927, of a toilet in Mexico. Who would think that would be beautiful? But it is. You know the one I'm talking about. Yeah. It's gorgeous. You think a toilet is gorgeous, but he was able to have that view of, again, these are lines. These are beautiful curved lines that he captured in a two-dimensional sense, but it makes you stop and think about life in terms of, well, maybe I should. To me, this is a huge message of art, is maybe I should stop and just look at life a little bit more from that viewpoint as well, because it's more interesting when I do. Yeah,
because I've been looking at the work of, I said, Stephen Shore, but I've also been looking at William Eggleston, Saul Leiter, all of whom photographed scenes in their world that at the time were completely ordinary. Absolutely mundane, that most people then and now would never consider for a photograph. But because they were looking at it with an artist's eye, they took those elements and were able to use these principles of composition about inclusion and exclusion to create images that are just like jaw-dropping.
Totally.
And I think that is part of the leap that photographers need to learn to make, is not passing judgment on what they're looking at, and rather see it differently. And then that leads to all these choices that we're talking about in terms of how you compose a photograph. Because if you already make the judgment that something that you're looking at is not worthy of a photograph, you're excluding a lot of possibilities.
Yeah,
because there are photographs everywhere. These photographers exemplify the fact that is so true. But talk to me about your own struggles, because I think every photographer has them.
Sure.
About getting past that idea, it's ordinary, it's mundane, it's not interesting, and moving past that and discovering the beauty that is there.
That almost comes to a philosophical point, in terms of giving, I think, first of all, it's just giving yourself the time to just be a photographer. Probably the biggest problem that I have, and my biggest struggle, is I get so busy with so many other things that I will drop out of photographing for weeks on end sometimes. And then I'll think, dude, when was the last time you took a photograph? So I'll make myself go out. I don't care if it's with an iPhone, and go out and photograph. I don't want to lose touch of this magical art form. But I think it's just like, make that time and take, just like in composition, a lot of times most of the time, I should say, it's removing things. Remove distractions that get in the way of your photography, and make sure you're just constantly developing it. Because I know, just from my own photography, that when I put myself in that place where I'm really focused and I'm really, I want to come back with some images that that are meaningful to me. And if they're meaningful to me, generally speaking, they're meaningful to other people. Then if I make that sort of a priority, then I'm going to make it happen. But you just got to keep putting yourself in that situation.
One of the things I think that the way I taught myself to start thinking compositionally was by a process of elimination. I would start eliminating things, trying to make things simpler and simpler sometimes to the point of abstraction. But that taught me about the relationships between objects. But it came to a point where I found myself making the same photographs over and over again. So I had mastered that ability to simplify and create relations between the various objects. But then it's just like, man, I'm just repeating myself. And then the challenge is, how much more can I add to this scene and still succeed before it falls apart? Right?
Interesting.
Talk about how you can use the principles to be able to make much more complex images. Like this, you mentioned at the end earlier about building in layers, and I think that's part and parcel of that process of making more complex images. Yeah, you can build in layers, but you still have to be conscious of the spatial relationships between objects and the lines and the shapes and all those things that we've been talking about.
All those things working together.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of like the idea, Joe McNally talks about the language of light, and I think it's a great way to approach light. And I think of composition as a vocabulary. If you have a limited vocabulary, you're going to end up taking the same photograph over and over again.
Yeah.
I get to the point where I live in a very beautiful place. I live right by the ocean. There's sunsets that take your breath away all the time. And I find myself just thinking, Mark, how many more beautiful sunsets can you capture? Are they that different? Probably not. But maybe if I put a person in there, then it becomes a different situation. So I think it's just, first of all, expanding your vocabulary is really important. As an analogy, I'm watching the new biography of Bob Dylan by Martin Scorsese, and it was really interesting to see how he developed his voice. He basically emulated like these great folk artists. Actually, I didn't know this, but even before he got into folk, he was more into rock, and then he got into folk, and he emulated, Woody Guthrie, and he eventually developed his own style that became uniquely Bob Dylan. But if you even listen to it, you'll hear these different elements in there. So I think he broadened his vocabulary in terms of music. It's really important to have a wide range of choices that you can make in terms of, like you're saying, can it be more complicated? Sure. But you still have to think about it in terms of what message am I trying to convey? What's ultimately the story I'm telling here? Mm-hmm. And if it's complicated and it helps you, that helps the story, fine. If it doesn't, then there's no point in it. You're just being overly complex. But this brings up, the second part of the book, I get into mood lines, and we can talk about that now or later, but I find those really interesting tools that can help you with your story.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Mood lines were, they're interesting because they were developed by not a photographer, but a landscape architect named John Ormsby Simmons, very famous landscape architect who wrote a book called Landscape Architecture. And what he found was that certain lines create certain moods or emotions. He actually did a scientific study by, he was doing outdoor architecture, and he could see if the lines of the area that he was describing were a certain way, then people felt a certain emotion from them. So I'll give you some examples. And so these have been translated from landscape architecture into design and photography. But I don't think anybody's done what I did, where I actually took each one of the lines he describes and showed a visual example of it. So for instance, if you want a very passive feeling, you want a kind of a serene, passive feeling, go with a flat horizontal line. Okay, it kind of makes sense. You kind of think, well, that makes sense, Mark. But what if you want a really unstable feeling? The other thing about telling a visual story is don't get stuck in one emotion. Life has a whole range of different emotions. So if you can tell that story in a number of different ways, like for instance, look at Annie Leibowitz's portraiture. You'll seldom see anybody smiling in one of her portraits. And, if you think about it, a photograph of a person with a phony smile isn't really that captivating. It's right. So she tends to try to get them to take on a certain mood. And, she creates the environment where they're going to feel that mood, but she doesn't really want them to have that happy smile. She wants them to come across as they are when nobody's looking at them. I think that's kind of her approach. So again, by knowing these different mood lines, it will help you tell that story. If you want it to be dark and moody, then you should use a set of lines that will help you bring about that feeling. If you want it to be, I have a amazing the self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh. One of the mood lines is a very jittery line. Like if you took a pencil and you drew it like your hand was shaking and you tried to draw a straight line, but it was all jittery. That's what his self-portrait looks like. It looks like he was incredibly jittery throughout the whole thing. And of course, everything we know about Van Gogh is that's exactly how he was. Very uncertain. And the mood line is termed tenuous, uncertain, wavering, which from at least the biographies I've seen of him, that's exactly how he felt about himself, since he never even sold one photograph of his own. I think Theo, his brother, is the one that bought one of his paintings, rather, not photographs. And here's one of the greatest artists of our time, but he was very uncertain. So again, knowing the vocabulary, you can speak photography more fluently. And I think that becomes really important and a lot more fun.
How is your teaching and especially the writing of this book helped you in terms of how you see?
Wow, I had a kind of a spiritual experience going through this book, and okay, I had to find an example of each one of these compositional elements, and some of them I didn't. I had examples of every one of them, but some of them I just didn't like, so I didn't put them in the book. I'm not going to put a photograph there for other people to see if I don't like it myself, obviously. But I found that I had virtually an example of every single one of these without knowing it. And what it did for me was it helped me identify my process at the time, kind of reverse engineering almost. Okay, so I took the photograph not thinking about what way I was composing it or whatever. I was just trying to get a photograph that I thought was really good and interesting, but I didn't know the thought process behind it. So here I am later, years later in many cases, discovering why that photograph looks good. Why does it work? And that was really cool. And so it's helped me a lot, doing all these interviews, writing in particular, because you have to really make sure when you're writing that it's accurate and that it comes across in an understandable way. So that, it's weird how aperture, it took me a day to write one page about the the definition of aperture and f-stops. And then I thought, well, why do we call it an f-stop? Why not an f number? Where did this word stop come into the picture? And, I finally found it in the Focal Encyclopedia. I didn't know this before, but the reason it's called a stop is lenses used to have a slot in them, and you would insert a metal, and you can still buy these at B&H. They actually make these lenses, but you'd insert a metal slot with an opening of different sizes, which are your aperture openings, and those are called stops. Those slots, those things that you slide in, are called stops. So that's how it became an f-stop. Well, that's kind of a point of trivia. And does that really change your photography much? Probably not, but it was still kind of fascinating. But, the process of writing and really making sure that everything in there is accurate caused me to clarify in my own mind many things, and I found that very useful.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
I'll probably go with Bob Holmes because I think his work is phenomenal. He's a travel photographer. He goes out and captures photographs that I'm envious of, and those are the photographers. I'm just like, oh, I'm so jealous that you got that photograph, Bob. Why wasn't it me? But the other reason I recommend Bob Holmes is because he's very articulate about his process, and he's very kind about how he explains things, which is why I've done so many interviews with him. But his work is outstanding, and his ability to convey to you as a person who wasn't there how he captured it is tremendous. So that's going to be my recommendation.
Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed having a chance to chew the cud with you in terms of composition. It was just something that's been on my mind a lot recently. So thank you.
You bet. My pleasure. And I hope I'm able to shed light on the subject and improve that vocabulary.
Thanks to Marc for making time for us. To find out more about Marc and his work, visit silberstudios.tv. And when you purchase his book, please use our Amazon affiliate link, as we receive a little off of each purchase to help support the show. Also, I'll be teaching a series of workshops where I teach my personal approach to street photography. I'll be in San Francisco in June at Street Photo SF and New Orleans in October. I've also just announced 2 more workshops, including one in New York City in October and one in Paris in September. You'll find links for all of these in the show notes and the Candid Frame website. Sign up today, and I look forward to meeting some of you in person. And you can also show your support of the show by writing a review in the iTunes Store. As people search for podcasts to listen to, these reviews can lead people to listen to us for the very first time, and that can make all the difference. So if you haven't already, please take the time to do it today. You can also support the show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon. And for as little as $2 a month, you can help us to not only meet the cost of production for the show, but allow us to improve our podcast, YouTube channel, and website. Or if you just want to make a one-time contribution to the show, you can do so via PayPal. You'll find links for both on the Candid Frame website or the show notes. Thanks to Sheila Bodine for her recent contribution. It means a lot to receive your support. Thank you. To access our complete archive of interviews, download the free Candid Frame app, available for Apple iOS and Android. Not only will you immediately receive the latest episode on your phone or tablet, but you can now easily share your favorite episodes on your social networks and help spread the word. And if you want to drop me a line with comments or suggestions for the show, you can email me directly from the app. Download it today by clicking on the link in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @IbadianX. And this is IbadianX, and this is The Candid Frame.